This is an Illamade production, live on the Illamade network. To all our viewership, please eavesdrop. In the building today, we have someone that I consider the professional of professionals. Tremendous insight, obviously, he has tremendous expertise as far as what he does. And someone who I just consider extremely interesting as far as what I've consumed, as far as the online content that he's done previously. Joining us today, we have Dr. Sohom Das. How are we doing, bro? You right?
Yeah, very good. Thank you for that lovely introduction.
Yeah, come
and
on.
for pronouncing my name right. Not
Oh yeah, I get it right. I mean,
yeah.
I've been seeing you a lot on the online circuit. So I was, yesterday I just spent the whole day in the mirror. So I'm kidding. But yeah, man, like I said, it's just super interesting. Like I was telling you earlier, I've got this newfound sort of infatuation with the whole psychological thing, criminality, and all of that. And obviously, I come across yours on Sean's channel. Obviously, big up Sean Atwood, a friend of the platform. And yeah, I just couldn't help but just watch everything. I mean, they're like 2 hours long, 4 hours long, but I'm just sitting there watching all of it, just tremendously intrigued. So, but yeah, just to get into the swing of things, if we could take it all the way back and you can talk to me a bit about your childhood, like
Sure.
What sort of child you were and the type of stuff you was into, if you can remember.
Absolutely. So I think I've always been interested in criminality in some way or another. So I used to listen to a lot of gangster rap when I was a teenager.
Oh, right.
So I'm older than I look. I grew up in the 90s. Everything from NWA, Snoop Doggy Dogg.
I'm jealous, honestly. That was probably the best era for music, probably.
Absolutely, yeah. And I grew up in a very sort of quite privileged, boring, white, idyllic village in Cheshire.
Right.
Which was great in some ways, in that it was very safe and sort of stable. There was very little crime. I don't think I ever really saw any crime. But it was also really, really dull in many ways.
Okay.
And it was also a bit odd for me because I was the only non-white person in my entire school.
Right.
And we're the only Asian family in the entire village. And like it's fine now, I'm in my 40s, but back then when I was a kid, it made me feel really sort of self-conscious.
Oh, yeah, pressure.
Just felt different.
Yeah.
Like looking back at it, I think it was more in my head than it was in anybody else's. Like, I didn't really get.
So would you get on with like the locals and like was there any like tiffs or anything?
No, not really. I mean, I got on with people in general in school, but I was always very paranoid about wanting to fit in and feeling different.
Right.
And on top of all that, my parents were pretty strict.
Right.
You'd expect, the Indian, very, very, very focused on education.
Definitely.
And so I think that kind of messed me up a little bit in that I didn't really understand why I had to study more than everyone else, and I was getting better grades than most of my friends, but I was allowed to do a lot less. So when they got a bit older, teenagers, they were out all the time, and even a bit older, they were going out drinking, etc., and I never got to do any of that. Well, I kind of did. I sort of stuck in and did it, but I wasn't permitted to.
Right.
So I think that kind of sort of started off in a bit of an inferiority complex in me.
Right. Interesting.
But I have to say my childhood was pretty good especially compared to my patients who go through like poverty and child abuse and blah, blah, blah. So I can't complain.
For sure. No, sick. And as far as the academic side of things, obviously you achieved the title of doctor. And obviously I can only imagine that's proper like rigorous sort of studying. Like you're pretty much in there when it comes to the books and all of that. Yeah. So what type of student would you say that you were, like before the whole, when shit got pretty much intense and you had to go down the doctor route sort of thing?
I was probably a teacher's worst nightmare because I was naturally very bright, so things came easy to me. At school, it changed when I went to medical school. When I was at school, things were easy for me. Plus my parents, my dad especially, used to make me study everything at home anyway.
No way.
So I was always months, if not years, ahead of what they were doing at school for most subjects. So that, I kind of understand why he did it, because he wanted to give me that edge, but in reality it made me really disinterested in school because it was too easy for me, and I'd done it all anyway. Like I would do maths like 3 or 4 years ahead of me, ahead of what I was doing at school. So I'd just be a pain in the ass when I got to school. I would just like talk all the time, distract the other kids, get told off by teachers, but still come near the top of my class. So I never really took studying very seriously, to be honest. I was good at it, and I got good grades because Dad made me.
Yeah.
But I never was interested. I was really immature.
Yeah.
And then when I went to uni, everything kind of flipped on its head because firstly, I was surrounded by extremely intelligent people. I wasn't used to that. I was used to being, a smart ass and being top of my class. And then when I get to medical school, everybody's at least as clever, and a lot of them are clever.
I can imagine. Yeah, I mean that doesn't sound like a joke. Pretty much like medical school. Like.
Yeah. And then on top of that, I had all this freedom. So whereas before I had to sneak out and do things behind my parents' back, I could do whatever I wanted. I went to uni in Edinburgh, I should say. So I was miles away from home. So I grew up in Cheshire, like, sort of 5 or 6 hours drive, maybe not, 4 or 5 hours drive to Edinburgh, so I was really far away. So I just went a bit wild, and it cost me, I almost failed my first year at medical school. I did get through it, but I was that close to sort of being kicked off the course just because I just didn't take it very seriously.
Just going crazy, basically, yeah. Well, it was straight partying and stuff.
Yeah. So I don't recommend it, and I regret it now. But at the time, I was just immature, man. I was 18 when I went to medical school, but I thought like a 14 or a 15-year-old.
I mean, because it could be a thing where maybe, obviously, you didn't have that opportunity to do so before, so you was just sort of exercising your right, sort of thing, innit?
Yeah.
On a sort of psychological level, like.
Yeah, well, I think that's the thing. If you kind of overstrip, I'm a father now, but if you've got to be really careful about
Definitely
how you put your boundaries down with your kids, right? Because some kids need an extra level of guidance, and you have to be on them, and I get that. But some kids, they will go the opposite way. They'll rebel, like myself. So if you're too strict, and then you give them a bit of freedom, they just go wild.
100%. Now, you made a previous mention of having a bit of an infatuation with criminality, like you mentioned the music and the films. So obviously the music, you said NWA, and I guess Dr. Dre and Snoop. And like, what can you give me some like other examples of the type of music that you sort of liked?
Yeah, so old school 90s hip hop. I liked back then, I still like now. So what to listen to? Cypress Hill, House of Pain. It wasn't all gangster rap. There was some conscious stuff there, like Tribe Called Quest, De La Soul. I'll tell you what I think is quite interesting about my interest in music was that I imagine you're quite a lot younger than me.
I thought you said, yeah, no, I was going to say I like music as well, hip hop, but yeah, probably, yeah.
But I think can I ask how old you are? Do you mind?
Yeah, I'm 31.
31, okay, so I'm 43. What I remember about being into all of that music back then was this, that it kind of, first of all, it's the vast majority of it's made by black people, and there were no black people around anywhere where I live.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine. It was all Emmerdale, pretty much.
yeah, exactly. I don't think I saw a black person until I was like, my late teens.
Yeah.
So it was kind of, I think I appropriated it, I think is what I'm saying. I was a bit mixed about my identity.
Makes sense.
Obviously, I'm not black, but I think I thought I was black because I wasn't white, so I didn't know what it was. That's one thing. And the other thing is that to be into that kind of music, especially where I lived in Poynton, it took a lot of time and effort to even find that music. So nowadays, any kid can just immediately find any tune from any artist. Whereas back then, if you're into Cypress Hill, if you're into Tribe Called Quest, you couldn't buy it like anywhere local. You'd have to actually get a train from Poynton into Stockport, somehow get some money off my parents, convince them to actually let me go into town, buy a record, come back, obviously dub it and give it to all my friends. So it was an effort. Like if you wanted to be into underground music, you had to put in time and effort into doing it, and it made it feel like it belonged to me a little bit.
That's a great analogy, yeah.
Whereas nowadays, I don't think, I don't know, but I imagine nothing really belongs to anybody because anybody can just get any music.
Pretty much, and it's like easy access, so it doesn't really create a desire to want to delve into why you like something.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
Because you can just flip whatever you
Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, it takes effort to get on a bus and blah blah blah. So yeah, no, makes perfect sense. Yeah. And as far as the films and stuff as well, films obviously had an impact on yourself also, as far as the whole criminality thing. So, I mean, I hate the term favourites because that's all minimised and stuff. But do you have a favourite film? I guess.
Yeah, I think all my favourite films, from even when I was a kid and even now, are probably gangster films. So Goodfellas is probably my favourite all-time film. I think City of God is often the
Brazilian one.
The Brazilian one, because that is a gangster film. It's not sort of typical.
Amazing.
But I think it's one of the best films I've ever seen. Old Boy, don't know if you've seen that Korean film.
No.
So I do think I like violent films, but it's not like, I like the psychology behind it. Do you know what I mean? I don't just like films that are just pure gore and don't have any kind of storyline or any kind of understanding of the characters. I think that's kind of connected to what I do.
You know, even with myself, I thought that, like, why do I like violent films so much? But it's not even that. Like, if you look at like the sort of the mafioso type of films or whatever, the majority of them are true stories. I'm into reality. Like, a lot of people like superheroes, someone flying, I don't know, a woman, like, lightning coming out her nose, I don't know. Like, but these people, they're into, like, crazy, like, I'm not into that because I don't think that's real.
Yeah.
Stuff like Goodfellas is more or less a true story.
Yeah.
Like, these people in there, they exist.
Yeah.
The Godfather is a depiction of the mafia culture that was around at a certain point. So I think that's what I'm into. So I wouldn't, like, me personally, I wouldn't go and say I like violence, but I like, if something's real, I'm interested.
So you want to understand people?
Yeah, and more so, I'm inspired as far as whether, like, obviously, you know, crime is wrong, whatever, but just the whole thing that people actually achieve this at a certain point in life is, it's amazing to me, like, sort of thing. Like, I mean, even looking at the whole organised crime, the whole mafia thing, it's like, these people achieved something so, like, they ran the world pretty much, like, at one point. Yeah.
No, I think I'm interested in, a bit like yourself, not just the actual violence, although that is interesting and it's a part of my job, but what's behind it, what's the reason behind it,
exactly.
and how it's kind of, just how people like the mob ingratiate themselves into society and how they control things.
Exactly.
It's fascinating.
Exactly. Okay, sweet. So you studied medicine, completed a medical degree, but upon graduating, you didn't really have an idea about what you wanted to sort of do. And basically, so you began working, I guess, as an A&E doctor after graduation?
Yeah, not quite. I did eventually. So basically, exactly like you say, I didn't really have a plan.
Yeah.
It would be nice to sit here and say that I was always wanted to be a forensic psychiatrist. I had no idea what I was doing. Didn't even really think about becoming a doctor, to be honest, throughout my entire degree. I don't know why, it just didn't occur to me to plan my life. And then I just bounced around a few different things. So I did do A&E eventually, but it's about 2 years down the line.
Right.
I worked as a junior doctor in Edinburgh for a bit. And then I actually went to Australia so I'd been about 2 years out of medical school in 2005 or 6. And out there I worked as an A&E doctor. And then I did a psychiatry placement whilst I was out there.
Right.
And immediately fell in love with it. Just because it's so bizarre. Like the people that I see would either be post-suicide attempt, so the lowest ebb, and to my surprise I felt I was quite good at connecting with them and just making them feel comfortable to talk. And the other type of patient I see would be people that are completely psychotic, so they have these really bizarre, often paranoid delusions and just this alternate reality that they obviously wasn't real, but they fully were invested in it. And I just liked asking questions and talking to people that had those experiences.
Interesting. So I've heard you gave a previous mention of how stumbling across, this word is going to ruin me today, just putting out the psychiatry.
Yeah.
You stumbled across that by accident?
I actually quite enjoyed. So I did a placement of it before I graduated, before I was a doctor in medical school, and I loved it. And I don't know why. I should have just thought, I really like doing this, and I should have made the decision to do it, but I didn't. I think part of it's because I was indecisive. Part of it was because I was so disorganised. I didn't really care or think about the future. But if I'm being honest, part of it was because when you specialise in psychiatry, you don't use almost all of your knowledge from everything else you learn. So, everything that I did from anatomy to physiology to blood tests to hormones, I used to know all that stuff. I've forgotten it all now because I just haven't worked in that field for so long. So
if you don't use it, you lose it, as they say.
Exactly. So when you go into psychiatry, you have to make a commitment to yourself to throw away everything you've done at medical school for the last 5 years.
Wow, that's crazy. Yeah, and so you said a thing where you travelled to Australia. So I guess that was after you graduated, you said?
It's about 2 years after I graduated, yeah.
So that was a psychiatry placement.
Started off doing A&E, and literally the hospital didn't have enough psychiatry doctors, so the admin staff there begged me to do 6 months of psychiatry because you couldn't fill the placement.
Right.
And they had too many A&E doctors.
Right.
So I could have been a dick and insisted on doing A&E because that's what the contract was, but I just thought I'm going to help her out. So.
And that's a big change as well, coming from the UK, going over to Australia. Like, what was the sort of the challenges you'd say that you faced?
I have to say I was quite lucky because 6 months before I went, another one of my friends who I went to med school with, who's also a junior doctor, he went out before me.
Right.
And so he set up like a place, and I was really close to him, so he set up a place for us to live. He had mates, blah, blah, blah. So I was quite lucky that I slot into this like social scene. Had I not, I think it would have been quite hard for me. I think something that I was very aware of was my skin colour. So it's weird having, as I said to you before, having grown up in an experience where I felt different. Yeah. Just to be clear, I wasn't a victim, and I wasn't like sort of targeted, but I just felt sensitive and paranoid about being a different colour. And then going to medical school, and none of that mattered because it's just such a melting pot. And then oddly going to Australia kind of brought those feelings back a little bit because I just went to a very white area. There were like some ethnic minorities. There's quite a lot of Aboriginal people where I lived, but it was very, very divided. So that's something I noticed straight away. I don't think I ever saw. I saw lots of Chinese students because I lived near the University of Sydney. Occasionally saw Indian people, but I never saw them integrate. It was really strange. So you'd have like groups of Indian people, groups of Chinese people, but I can't think of one time where I saw like friends of Indian people with Chinese people or white people.
That's interesting.
So that was odd for me to kind of get my head around. Yeah.
Interesting. And as far as the placement, was it here where I guess your first day on the job, someone punched you in the face?
So that's after I came back. So that placement I did was just psychiatry. It wasn't forensic psychiatry. So I wasn't working with offenders yet. Then I came back, did a few exams, and then I started working as a junior doctor. So there's different sort of levels of junior doctor, but when you're a senior house officer, you cycle through like 6 months of different psychiatry placements. So I did like child and adolescent psychiatry, liaison psychiatry, it's like suicide attempts, old age psychiatry, and then I did 6 months of forensics. And on my very first day on a forensic ward, which would have been, I think, I can't remember the exact year, 2011 or 12, I got punched in the face, yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, tell us about that. I mean, I've heard you say it previously, and, you know, I had a fat smile on your face. I was like, right, this guy is a better man than me, to be honest. Like, yeah, so tell us about that experience.
Sure. So I suppose I'm always very aware that I shouldn't sort of add to the stigma of mental illness by, you know, I categorically want to say that most people who have mental illnesses are not dangerous and not violent.
Absolutely.
But it's the ones that I see as a forensic psychiatrist. Like, we see people who come from prison or have committed serious violence, so I see the people that are violent. So it was on a medium secure unit in North London, and basically I was trying to, so it's my very first day, and I was trying to show off, and then we had a ward round later on that day.
By doing what?
So I wanted to show off to my consultant, because I was really keen to like, you know, do the training and blah, blah, blah. So instead of waiting for the ward round like everyone else, I actually went onto the ward early in the morning. So I got there earlier than I was supposed to start, like at 9 o'clock and meet the team, blah, blah, blah. But I got there for like 7:30, 8, so that I could interview the patients, so that when we had the ward round, I could sort of say, well, actually, these are my findings. I'm just showing off. There's no other way to put it. So I shouldn't have even been there. Like, I wasn't supposed to be on the ward, hadn't had my induction, blah, blah, blah. But I kind of convinced the nurses to let me in, because I told them who I was. And because I didn't know, because I hadn't done my induction and spoken to the nurses, I didn't know anything about any of the patients. I didn't know the background histories. I knew that it's a medium secure ward, so they must be dangerous to be there in the first place. But I didn't know anything about the individuals, which was a mistake. And so this one guy, I was interviewing one guy who was my patient, or the patient on our team. And this other guy, the one who ended up hitting me, he wasn't even on our team. He had nothing to do with us, but he was really transfixed by me. So he kept looking at me through the window, kept knocking on the door. And he wasn't being aggressive, but he was just asking these really weird questions. Yeah. So I was trying to interview this guy, and he just like opened the door, and he was just make these really odd statements about God. He'd say stuff like, everybody's a god, but some gods are stronger than others. Just stuff that it wasn't aggressive or threatening, but it's just bizarre. And I just sort of not even politely, I just sort of shoot him off basically, because I was trying to do my interviews. And this happened 3 or 4 times. Then he made other odd comments, like asking me, sort of insinuating that we knew each other. So he'd be like, "Do you remember that time that blah blah blah?" And I was like, "I've never met you before in my life." He was completely delusional, but I didn't even realise that at the time. And then basically, I came out of the interview room, and he ran up behind me and punched me really hard in the back of the head, or the side of the head.
Oh right.
And
so he kind of sneaked you, like.
Yeah. It was a complete sucker punch. But knocked me out. I don't remember being hit, but I remember just waking up on the floor. Right. I don't think I was out for very long, probably a couple of seconds. Right. And then I could sort of see him running off. And then all the nurses, or some of the nurses, saw, so they sort of chased him.
How big was he? Was he like a lump?
He was about average, I'd say. He wasn't huge.
Right.
But it was just really bizarre. The whole thing was really surreal, because there was no threat. He didn't indicate in any way that he was kind of, if anything, he was like over friendly towards me. So it was just very bizarre. But I think, I don't want to minimise it. And I know that other people in these kind of units do get assaulted, and sometimes it's very severe. But if I'm being honest, it didn't bother me because it happened so quickly, and because it was all like I didn't even know it was happening. It didn't feel scary to me. It just felt really surreal. I sort of woke up with a headache. It was a bit embarrassing, to be honest, because then all the other patients on the ward who got to know me over the next few weeks kept referring to me as that doctor. They got punched, basically.
Yeah, a bit of reputation.
Exactly, yeah. You don't want to start a new job in a new placement as the guy that got punched on his first day.
For sure.
But I found out later that he had these like psychotic delusions. So he had what we call Frugoli syndrome. So he was convinced that I was somebody from his past in disguise. So he thought I was like the school bully that was disguising myself as a doctor.
These things are so interesting, and like these conditions, that's crazy.
It is crazy.
Yeah. And so forensic psychiatry, if we talk about the actual spec of that whole occupation, obviously bro science, how I understood it, was basically you're looking into why someone caused or did something on a psychological level. So the reason behind why they, I guess, committed whatever act that they did, which more time is negative, right?
Yeah, pretty much. So what it is we assess. There's kind of two parts to it. There's the assessing them, which is the stuff that I'm doing now, which includes being an expert witness. So they're on trial for some serious offence. So it can either be assault, sometimes rape, sometimes arson, sometimes even murder. And if either they've got a mental illness, or we think they've got a mental illness or a personality disorder, then someone like me, a forensic psychiatrist, will assess them and will write a court report to the judge saying this person has or hasn't got a mental illness. And if they do, they were suffering these symptoms at the time. Obviously, we get other evidence, witness statements, CCTV. And if they were suffering symptoms, they were either criminally responsible or not. And if they weren't criminally responsible, then they're either hospital or prison. And if it's hospital, what level of security and what kind of treatment. So it's kind of like a flow chart of how we help people. That's one part of it. And then the second part is it within these secure units. So it's for people who are really unwell and who've been sectioned under a criminal section of the Mental Health Act. They've gone to these hospitals rather than prison. So they've done something that would have ended up in prison if they'd been sane. But because they're so unwell, they need rehabilitation and treatment rather than punishment to make them safe again.
Makes sense, yeah. And is it like, do you have any difficulties sort of like with the judges as far as having them believe in the science? Because I'm just assuming, but maybe there could be some judges who are pretty old school and they're just like, no, like law and punishment, like that's it sort of thing. Are there judges that are like, you know what, like I don't know about all this science business, like sort of thing?
Yes is the answer to that. I think that they're quite rare. I'd say 80 to 90% of the time when I make a recommendation, the judges will listen to it.
Yeah.
Because the judge kind of decides to get a psychiatric opinion in the first place. So this does happen, but it doesn't make sense for a judge to ask for a psychiatric opinion and then ignore it. That does happen.
Right.
But I think it's because the judge already has a preconception. Like he already thinks that this person, say if it's something really severe like a attempted murder or a murder, he doesn't like the look of the guy, doesn't like the cut of his dick.
Yeah.
So he's already made his decisions that the guy...
Preconceived,
Yeah, exactly, preconceived. Like he might have a bit of depression or whatever, but he's not, he's still criminally culpable. His mental illness doesn't explain his offending.
Definitely.
And they have that. So again, I should point out this is the minority of the time, but whatever, 5-10% of the time, they'll have that preconception. Then they'll ask me for my opinion, and I'll write something which differs from what they thought, and they'll just be like, fuck that. And they'll just ignore me.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It's very frustrating because I get paid for it, but
for sure.
But it does kind of make me feel, why did you? I spent like 2 hours assessing him, probably about 10 hours writing the report. Yeah. And you just ignoring it. So why even ask me for my opinion?
For sure.
It's frustrating.
Because I often would know that. I mean, people take hierarchy straight to the head, I guess. And obviously the judge is like, yo, this is how we're doing things, isn't it? Like besides whatever you got to say. But
the other one thing I'll mention if you don't mind, is
for sure.
that I think is interesting, or more scary than interesting, is this. Sometimes when I'm working in court. And again, this is a minority of the cases, but there's some defendants that come in and they definitely need to be transferred to hospital because they're acutely unwell. They're like hearing voices, paranoid delusions, believing people are wanting to hurt them, poisoning them, which makes them dangerous because they can attack random people. And unfortunately, the process of getting them into hospital is really long, convoluted, and complicated. So sometimes it takes us as a court sort of psychiatry team days to get somebody in because there's just not enough beds to allow them in, especially in the secure units.
Right.
So just connected to what he was asking before, occasionally I've seen cases where the judge has released the person, not because they don't believe the report, but because they get so fed up of that person coming into court, taking up court time, going back to prison for one night to be remanded to come back in. Yeah. The judges themselves, after 2 or 3 days, either don't care or about our system or don't have the patience to wait. So they're just like, well, you've had 3 days to sort out an admission and you haven't done it, so I'm just going to release him. And that is scary because it doesn't happen that often, but once every few months we release somebody who I think is really potentially quite dangerous to other people or is a risk for themselves, either suicide or just saying the wrong thing to the wrong person.
Yeah,
for sure. They can get smacked in the face. So yeah, that's something that happens probably more often than a judge ignoring my evidence. Yeah. Is a judge just not having the patience to wait.
I mean, we've seen cases on the news as well. I mean, I don't know someone specifically, but I know there's been scenarios where they've just done something so crazy, and then lo and behold, there's someone who should have been sectioned, but they didn't get sectioned, I guess, in that sort of way.
Yeah.
And what I found interesting, you was talking previously in a previous interview, sort of like the term doctor, right? And how it applies to yourself. Now, obviously, a typical doctor, if someone's unwell, you give them treatment. I mean, because it's best for them to have the treatment. Yeah. But in your case, you have to get someone on your side for them to open up in order to give you the most accurate assessment. Yeah. Obviously, speaking to you, like you got a calm demeanor, like you're pretty easy to talk to, I'd say. So you have those skills. So just talk about like having to, I guess, get someone to open up and get them to be on your side so you can assess them.
Sure. So I would argue that psychiatry is probably, out of all the different fields of medicine, from everything from from GPs to surgery, is probably the one where the communication skills is the most important. Yeah. Because in any other field, you want your doctor to be nice to you and you want him to be easy to speak to, but it doesn't really matter, right? If you've got a heart surgeon who's a bit of a dick, but he's a good heart surgeon, that's more important than somebody...
Yeah, bring me him anytime.
Exactly, who's friendly and doesn't know what they're doing when they're cutting you open. But whereas, just exactly what you said, I think with psychiatry, you have to not just have good communication skills.
I was quoting you, but I'm just saying, when you said that, I was like, that's something.
Yeah, absolutely. You've got to be able to let them open up. So I think the way to do that is, there are definitely strategies, and you have to kind of assess things, and you have to do it live as you're seeing somebody. So if I do a typical assessment for a court report in prison, I'm only with them for about an hour or so. And that's not that long a period of time to get like an idea of all of their background, plus what actually happened with the crime, plus their mental state. So it depends on what they're like. So if they're talkative, then that's really easy. If they're paranoid or really guarded or secretive, then you have to try and lull them into a false sense of security just by talking about anything.
Right.
So I'll stop with my proper structured psychiatric assessment. I'm supposed to ask them about the childhood, previous medications, blah, blah, blah. I've got a list in my head. I just get rid of that list, and I just try and get them to open up about anything. And then after I've got them talking a little bit, I'll try and ask them, instead of saying, what was your thought process during the crime, I'll try and make it more general. Like, can you tell me how have you ended up here? Like, why are you in prison? What do you think about that? Do you think it's fair? So there are subtler ways to get somebody to talk about what they want to talk about. Yeah.
I mean, so I mean, that what you're saying right now is stuff that you do. It's not necessarily what you've been told to do, sort of thing. You just found your way on how to get people to open up.
You have to have a bit of a intuition, I think, instinct.
For sure. That's mad interesting. So your job entails you having to work in courts, prisons, and I guess mental institutions.
Yeah,
can we call them that?
Secure units.
Secure units, right? So, which, in your opinion, would you find the most challenging to work in at those three in particular?
Yeah, that's a good question. They're all challenging in different ways. I think if I had to say one was the hardest, I would say prison is the hardest.
Right.
And I'll tell you why. Because when you're in court, you're only responsible for a one-off assessment, and your role is to get as much information as you can out of that person. But even if you don't succeed, so if the person's floridly psychotic or just doesn't like you, like thinks that you're part of the court process, hates the police, hates judges, blah, blah, blah. Occasionally I see people who literally won't tell me anything. Then at least you can go by the background evidence. So witness statements, medical records, GP records, speaks to the GP, speaks to the psychiatrist. So you can usually piece together enough material to give some sort of opinion. So that's the challenge of being in a court. And in medium secure units, there's like high secure units like Broadmoor, then medium and low. And I've done most of my training in medium secure units. You're there with the patient for a really long period of time. So their rehabilitation often takes years, sometimes several years, sometimes even decades occasionally. So the pace is quite slow. So if you have a bad day with a patient or you don't get something out of them, there's no rush because you're going to see them every week for months, years on end. But they're quite tense environments because patients often kick off more in secure units than they would in prison. But the reason prison is hard is because you don't have the luxury of being there for the long time with the prisoners.
Right.
Because there's only like one psychiatrist covering hundreds of prisoners, so you can't see that. You don't have the time to see them every week. You just can only see them occasionally, and often you don't get like stuff like medical notes or background information. So there's a lot more pressure to try and make a psychiatric evaluation.
Right. So you don't have the means that you would need to actually do the
the means and the times. Another thing that lacks compared to like the hospitals is that hospitals obviously have psychiatric nurses who are very well trained, whereas prison officers, how do I put this delicately? They're not trained in recognising mental health issues, number one.
Right.
Number two, I think it's fair to say that some of them are quite hard work. Some of them are big, beefy guys.
And they're understaffed as well. I mean, I hear that a lot.
Yeah, understaffed, under pressure. Some of them don't give a shit about mental illness. They just want to, keep the prisoners in line.
I can imagine, yeah.
And if anybody says or does anything weird, they don't have any sympathy for them at all.
Crazy.